Thanks everyone for joining. Provide the normal acknowledgement of country. We are here on Gadigal lands. University of Sydney was built on those lands. And we acknowledge and respect elders past, present, and emerging. It is my pleasure to welcome to Transport Lab's first seminar of 2026, Michael Replogle. Michael was my first supervisor at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Montgomery County Planning Department, Transportation Planning Group, back 1989, one or two. And I was working as a young modeler in his group. And he has since moved on to bigger and better things. And I believe he'll give you some background of his evolution and talking particularly about transport in New York. So let's give a welcome to Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And just a question. I know you're doing video. Is it from this camera here that you're doing the video, or is it the whole room?
No, it's just this room. So
oh, it's just capture
screen and your voice.
Okay, very good. Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm going to talk about New York City and beyond, looking at transformation of transportation. Can everyone hear me, including in the back? I'm going to cover a lot of ground fairly quickly, give kind of an overview of many of the things that I've worked on and I'm working on still today. As David mentioned, we started out working together at Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, looking at how to better coordinate land use and transportation policy and developing what at that time were quite cutting edge travel demand models to figure out how much employment and housing could be accommodated without exceeding certain thresholds for traffic congestion, and looking at the impact of building different transport facilities and also the impact of different policies on how much we could accomplish in terms of economic development. And what we found through the comprehensive growth policy study, which was in some ways a capstone of that work over nearly a decade, was that the county could in fact double its amount of housing and employment without excessive traffic congestion if it concentrated the development in a more transit-oriented pattern, made communities more walkable and bikeable, and provided better economic incentives through parking pricing and transport pricing to help move people away from the car and into use of alternative modes. And since then, these travel models have continued to evolve. I've moved, frankly, beyond regional travel demand modeling and think most of these are basically illusions that we're creating about the future being just a projection of the past, and that we're far better off developing public policy analysis frameworks that are grounded in what kind of future we want, and then figuring out how to achieve those futures through appropriate kinds of investment and policies, and then using these analytic tools to help us figure out how to get there, rather than using the tools to simply justify widening more roads, which is how they're mostly used. So all of this comes down to a few different paradigm elements of what's less sustainable: sprawl, investment in more roads that lead to more traffic, sidewalks that go nowhere, and more sustainable patterns where we better manage street space to favor public transport, walking, and cycling, and concentrating development around those patterns. While I was at the Park and Planning Commission in Maryland, I developed a campaign called Bikes Not Bombs, where we recycled over about a 5-year period 10,000 bicycles to teachers and health workers in Nicaragua. and used that as a way of countering US policy, which was attacking a left-wing government there that was promoting health and education. And we developed bicycle assembly workshops in Nicaragua, used secondhand bikes to capitalize the bicycle assembly industry in that country, and to alleviate some of their transportation crisis. We replicated that pattern in a few other countries, Mozambique and Haiti, and used that as a platform to develop the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. I also wrote a book called Bicycles and Public Transportation back in 1982, 83, looking at how people come and go and get to and from public transport in different countries over the last century, and what that narrative and analysis tells us about how to make cities and regional development more sustainable. And so in developing these tools and models and institutions, my focus has been on documenting, disseminating, and scaling best practices in transportation, looking across the world and borrowing best practices from Asia and Europe, and trying to bring that to the United States, and also helping countries in the global South innovate and learn from each other and from global best practice. And see, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. So about this time in the early 1990s, with some colleagues, we came up with this paradigm: avoid, shift, improve, with Lee Shipper, who was at the University of California, talking about how do we avoid unnecessary and low value travel with smart pricing, development, logistics, supply chains, communications, how to shift travel to more efficient modes, whether it's by personal or goods transport, and then how to improve the efficiency of the remaining transport through better network efficiency, electrification, and favoring lighter, efficient, smaller, and slower vehicles and lower carbon modes. I worked for 17 years for the Environmental Defense Fund as their transportation director, and trying to hold US regions accountable for air quality impacts of transport decision-making and long-range plans, and trying to advance congestion pricing and demand management. We had some success with this, but a lot of the work led to states, in fact, requiring inspection and maintenance programs and cleaner fuels and vehicles, but we fell short on being able to get a lot of regions to seriously shift money away from expansion of roads and into public transport, walking and cycling. Some did, but a lot of them promised to develop the public transport, but always in the out years of the transport plan, constantly sort of rolling over the promises that, yes, we're going to build that new bus rapid transit line or rail line 10 years or 15 years from now, and continuing to push those promises into the future while moving forward with road expansions. In the mid-'80s, I founded ITDP to help change policies, not just with the bicycle logistics and recycling efforts in Nicaragua, Mozambique, and Haiti, but also focusing on getting multilateral development banks to shift their spending priorities towards these more sustainable modes. I did some research for the World Bank in 1989-90. This non-motorized vehicles in Asian cities report was part of the Asia Urban Transport Sector Study, and helped the bank reorient some of its policies in this direction. And ITDP has since this time grown now to over 150 staff working in 8 or more countries and different regions of the world. And in fact, we got in 2012 the 8 largest multilateral development banks to pledge $175 billion over 10 years towards more sustainable transport with annual reporting on their progress. We developed a sustainable transport appraisal rating tool to help the multilateral banks evaluate their progress against these goals in how they were spending money and the impacts of different projects. Also did a lot of appraisal work developing sketch modeling tools at the country, regional, and global level, looking at the impacts of different transport investment and spending patterns. This culminated in some work that was published a few years ago, the Compact City Scenario Electrified, which looked at 4 different patterns of business as usual development, vehicle electrification alone versus building denser mixed-use cities focused on public transport, cycling, and walking, but still focusing on fossil-fueled vehicle technology. And then a compact city electrified strategy, which brought those 2 elements together and found if indeed we brought all those together, we could reduce greenhouse emissions in the urban transport sector globally from 120 gigatons down to 60, rather than down to 75 with electrification alone, or 98 with just the more compact development. And this approach, we quantified in various ways how much spending would be required to implement these different strategies, and found, in fact, by combining the compact development with the electrification, we could cut direct global public and private costs of urban passenger transport by 1/3, or roughly $5 trillion annually going out to 2050. And there's a lot of stuff behind this, and there's citations for a lot of that. We spent a lot of effort at ITDP in developing different standards for developing more sustainable transport, looking at street design, looking at transit-oriented development, at bike sharing, at bus rapid transit, and electric bikes and the like, and also working with partner organizations and promoting the adoption of electrification goals in vehicle technology deployment in transport. And I think there's a huge role to be played through development and adoption of standards. So I want to turn now from that sort of global picture to the work I did starting in 2015. I went to work for New York City Department of Transportation as Deputy Commissioner for Policy for 6 years under Mayor de Blasio and Commissioner Polly Trottenberg. And New York City DOT is responsible for all of the streets and highways and bridges that are not toll bridges or toll highways within New York City. About $1 billion annual operating budget, a $17 billion 10-year capital program, almost 6,000 employees. We manage the streets, sidewalks, bridges, ferry services, the largest speed camera network in North America, a 1,300-mile bike network, 13,000 signalized traffic intersections that are connected, 300,000 streetlights, and the largest bike share system in the Western Hemisphere, which actually now is up to 38,000. It will be 40,000 by the end of this year. So New York's a city of almost 8.5 million people. In the city itself, part of a metro area with about 20 million people in 2,100 square kilometers. It's got the best public transport network in North America. And most of that's operated by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. And very extensive network, and has basically fueled the success of the metro area economically. New York City, where I was working, basically doing long-range strategy, development and implementation and monitoring. Our key goal was Vision Zero, of reducing traffic fatalities to zero, creating a more sustainable transport mode share, boosting bus speeds, boosting electrification, cutting pollution, effectively allocating street space, and trying to transform our freight system and create a culture of compliance with our traffic rules. 2 and 3 trips in New York City are by walking, cycling, or public transport. And in fact, when we were there, I helped the city develop and adopt a goal of 80% of all trips to be by sustainable modes by 2030. Looking at peer cities around the world, like Berlin, which is already at 70%. New York is moving in those directions, despite the issues that we had with COVID setting us back in certain areas. We're still continuing, I think, in largely the right direction. And this has happened through 4 mayoral administrations. We had some slippage under the last one, Mayor Adams, who left under a cloud of corruption scandal. But Mayor Bloomberg laid the foundations for this transformation back in the 2000s. Bill de Blasio came in 2014, and then Mandami just got elected and took office a couple months ago, and I think his promises to become a very effective mayor, especially on transport in the public realm. As I mentioned, Vision Zero has been a key goal. It was first put forward as a larger framework under Bloomberg, laid some foundations for this, but when de Blasio ran for mayor in 2013-14, he made this a centerpiece of his first run for office. The idea of that the only number of people that's acceptable to be killed in the traffic system is 0, that we should take a safe systems approach in designing and operating our transportation system, just like aviation takes, and saying that the roads should be forgiving of human error. The price of making a mistake in the traffic system should not be a death penalty. You can't stop all crashes, but you can make the consequences less severe. And we did also recognize that federal action is needed to help support and achieve these goals, particularly because the federal government controls vehicle design standards. The key cornerstones of our Vision Zero initiative, which was quite successful, was to cut the citywide speed limit, to adopt more effective safety education, to do stronger enforcement of traffic laws with both police and cameras, and redesign streets and intersections for safety. The key to this was strong mayoral leadership and the supportive program structure. One of the first things de Blasio did to implement this as mayor was to set up a Vision Zero task force, which engaged 12 city agencies and cut across the bureaucratic boundaries between them. And every 2 weeks, senior leadership from these agencies would meet to help coordinate to implement Vision Zero goals, which would be adopted and revised every year when we monitor progress together. I need not tell you, being in Australia, how speed cameras work. One thing I'm always struck by when I come to Australia is that people actually honor the speed limits in most places. Not always, but most places, because they're pretty ubiquitous speed cameras, and the fines are considerable, and you can lose your license and registration if you don't honor it. We're not quite as effective as that in New York, but while I was deputy commissioner, we developed the largest speed camera program in North America and deployed about 2,400 speed cameras across the city and school zones, and found speed camera violations at camera locations were down by almost 3/4, that injuries at speed camera locations went down by 17%. And most motorists who got a speed camera violation notice didn't get another one within the year. Although a few drivers were aggressive recidivists on this. And the likelihood someone will be killed hit by a vehicle at 40 miles an hour, only 1 out of 10 pedestrians survives, whereas at 20 miles an hour, 9 of 10 pedestrians survive. So speed does matter, speed kills. We used a toolbox of different engineering approaches to implement Vision Zero, from daylighting at intersections so pedestrians could better see drivers and vice versa, count down traffic signals telling pedestrians how much time they have to cross, with also giving pedestrian advance opportunity to cross the street in the direction of traffic flow before the traffic would be released. You'd have a leading pedestrian interval by 7 or 10 seconds, so the pedestrian would be well established in the intersection before the traffic would start to proceed. Signal timing was used. In some cases, we were designing arterials so that the traffic speed for the green progression was set at 15 miles an hour, which was the speed of bicyclists on the street, favoring cycling traffic and better traffic interaction. Better refuge islands, road diets to narrow streets, sidewalk extensions, and the like. With these tools together, we were able to transform some of our major arterials, which were the most hazardous in the city, into places that were safe to walk and cycle. Queens Boulevard had been known as the Boulevard of Death because as many as 18 people were killed a year in a 6-mile stretch of roadway in the late 20 teens. After we implemented these improvements in 2015 to 2018, as you can see, the before, the above, and the after below here, or here, the before and the after, we in fact were able to bring down road fatalities. So we went 3 years in a row with 0 fatalities on this roadway that previously had a huge number. And we replicated that on other major corridors across the city with various kinds of street improvements, protected bike lanes, pedestrian safety improvements. Again, you see before and after images. We implemented a left turn traffic calming at hundreds of intersections across the city to reduce the speed of turning vehicles so that drivers were less likely to kill people or injure them in crosswalks. We implemented over 1,000 kilometers of protected cycle lanes, 2,400 total as of last year, and closed a lot of the gaps in the network. We found network gap connectivity. Closing those things was one of the most strategically important things that we could do. This is on the Brooklyn Bridge where we'd had a key gap, and tried to create a lot of these parking protected bike lanes on different avenues. During the COVID era, of course, like cities around the world, we experienced significant changes in transportation patterns, but used that as an opportunity to reconfigure a lot of our streets, to expand the bicycle network, to expand opportunities for walking, cycling, public space in streets. We developed, and I created the architecture for our Open Streets, Open Restaurants program, in which we converted 10,000 parking spaces into restaurant space and saved over 100,000 jobs in the restaurant industry at a time when the city was feeling really bad because everybody was stuck inside. And it felt like the city had sort of socially collapsed in certain ways. The Open Restaurants was successful in no small part because it was a bottoms-up, rights-based program. With simple criteria, we told restaurateurs that if they could meet the half dozen simple criteria, they could take street space or sidewalk space and put tables and chairs out and open up, and we would come back and do compliance inspections to make sure that they were in fact following the rules after the fact. And so this self-certification with compliance checks showed how nimble city government could be if it got out of the way of itself in trying to implement reforms in street management. Unfortunately, a lot of the benefits of the open restaurants program were destroyed in 2024 when a much more pro-car city council put through a bill that required the sheds for restaurants to go into storage in the winter for several months. And so the number of restaurants in the program fell by 3/4. The new mayor has pledged to reverse this, and we have a new city council with the city council chair and the transportation committee chair much more supportive of restoring this program in an effective way. We also developed the largest bike sharing program in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, with $100 million investment from the private sector, doubling the service area and tripling the number of bikes by the end of this year to 40,000, over 2,000 stations. About 43% of these are now pedal assist e-bikes. We have about 2,800 stations in the city. The average bike gets used 7 times or more a day. The e-bikes get used more frequently than the pedal bikes alone. There's 180,000 members who are signed up, and a lot of tourists who come on top of that. Over 100,000 daily rides, so more than most public transport systems in other American cities. About 1.6 million active riders in the system overall, and very effective public-private partnership. And there's a lot of safety in numbers. We saw the number of cyclists triple in New York City over the last few years, and the number of fatalities remained fairly constant. We've also done a lot to give more priority for buses and trucks with select bus corridors, automated lane enforcement, transit signal priority, expanded loading zones. This is 14th Street in New York, which used to be one of the slowest cross streets, now operating very effectively as a complement to the subway that runs underneath that street. Here you see the 14th Street transit and truck priority lane. So trucks can go through on this along with buses, but cars can only access a block at a time, and then they have to turn off. So they can access for pickup and drop off only. Still a lot of conflicts over loading and unloading in the city, and over the rules by which trucks pay fines for double parking and things like that. I spent a lot of time trying to reform these systems when I was in, so that there were not so many incentives for the trucking industry to just regard traffic violations as a cost of doing business, but to focus on creating a culture of compliance with traffic rules. We've done a lot to also develop better loading and unloading zones. A lot of informal loading and unloading has been going on in New York streets for a while, in curb space, legal or illegal. And now we're trying to create more micro freight hubs in the city so that we can reduce congestion and make these systems work better. Off-hour deliveries program has encouraged successfully a lot of truck deliveries to take place in evening and early morning hours, with support for low noise cargo handling equipment. And truckers can in fact make 2 or 3 times as many deliveries if they deliver in off hours compared to delivering during the heart of the day in denser, busy neighborhoods. But of course, truckers often don't control when they make deliveries. It's really up to the receivers. And so a lot of this was support for the receivers to adopt these systems for off-hour access. Congestion pricing is a real success story in New York, and speeds in the city since we implemented this after a long, long struggle. It's been in effect now for a little over a year, and we've got a 7% increase in weekday speeds, and weekend speeds are up over 10%, and this within the core area. And this is after 3 years of declining speeds in the central business district. Benefits have spilled over also areas outside of this charging zone, which are experiencing lower traffic, lower noise, better safety, less pollution. Traffic's moving faster with congestion pricing on a majority of motorways, and there's a greater shift from medium and heavy duty vehicles to multi-purpose vehicles for deliveries. Pedal assist cargo e-bikes are playing an increasing role in New York City. Big conflict over vehicle dimension and speed requirements in the regulations. We basically started a pilot under my leadership to give pedal assist e-cargo bikes free access to any commercial parking space or loading space in the city at no charge. And also allowing use of the bike lanes in the streets and allowing loading and unloading on sidewalks with a clear path. So now we have several thousand of these making deliveries in the city, and often replacing smaller trucks one-on-one in terms and boosting productivity of the freight system and reducing congestion. Cities now piloting e-cargo bike ferry connections, as you've seen also in Paris and Brussels and some other cities. But you know, secure bike parking is a place where New York's falling short, and where you know, half of delivery workers have had their bikes stolen. We've got a grossly inadequate number of places to securely park bikes, with over 2 million New Yorkers owning a bike and only 24,000 racks in the city. The city, after years of dragging its feet, finally issued a contract to create 500 bike pods like the one you see in the center and bottom there, which will be neighborhood-based secure bike parking. E-bike safety is an issue in the city, largely driven by inadequate federal regulation over battery technologies, and so there are fires caused by badly manufactured or badly treated e-bike batteries that get charged sometimes in people's apartments, sometimes in large quantities. The city's created a battery swapping pilot program and is working to make sure that the delivery drivers using these e-bikes get access to the safer technologies. So continued conflict over e-bikes and where they should belong and what the speed limit should be. The city won authority in 2024 to set a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit citywide. I and many others advocated for the city to match bike and motor vehicle speed limits to make them more easily understood and enforceable, and to make it overall safer. But this is a continuous controversy. The city instead lowered the bike speed limit to 15 miles an hour, and the police commissioner started to issue criminal summonses against the bike delivery drivers, many of whom are immigrants. And it's become an instrument for the federal ICE people to grab people and deport them from the country for simply going 20 miles an hour on an e-bike or running a red light. So there are protests in the city by delivery drivers and things like that. So conclusions about New York City, that you know, the COVID epidemic showed that the city could be creative and nimble and innovative and reallocate street space and empower stakeholders to make change quickly in good ways. But the city has also faced major constraints under its procurement rules and the politics of trying to change institutional practices. But public-private partnerships like our City Bike program have shown that they can be very effective at delivering results through innovative work together. That parking and road user charging can make a big difference. Street space allocation, use of better apps and regulations are all areas of opportunity. Mayoral leadership is certainly vital, but we also need to look at how to influence culture and media and technical and civic leadership to make change. There's so much that cities around the world can learn from each other. So now I'd like to close my talk by talking about another problem that is more in the pattern of how do we deal with the car-dependent parts of our countries and suburbs and places where there's lots of pressure for traffic growth because the alternatives to driving aren't so good as they are in New York City. And a lot of places are still adding more general purpose lanes to deal with congestion on motorways. But as we add motorway capacity, induced demand cancels gains, often in a matter of a few years, adding to more traffic. And a lot of states have developed managed lanes. A lot of them have developed HOV lanes for high occupancy vehicles. But increasingly, the emphasis has been on high occupancy toll lanes that may give a discount or free travel for carpools. But if these are additional lanes, they still induce more traffic and sprawl. And so these are also costly, and it takes years to build them. They induce more traffic. So a new type of managed lane that I've been working with some other partners in promoting is hotter lanes. It's a bit of an awkward acronym: high occupancy transit and tolls on existing lanes with rewards. I didn't invent this term. It came from Pat DeCorla-Souza at the Federal Highway Administration. But you know, for now, it stands as a way of talking about a different way of trying to address the pressures to deal with traffic congestion without widening roadways. So hotter lanes look like hot lanes, but they boost efficiency of the existing lanes by pricing some of the lanes while paying incentives to travelers who share rides. In fact, this comes from some analytic work that DeCorla-Souza did at Federal Highways. He just recently retired, but showing how if you offer incentives for people to get into carpools and you put tolls on some of these, on these managed lanes that used to be free lanes, then by shifting about 14% of the traffic, 7,200 vehicles per hour per lane on a 4-lane motorway, then you can in fact boost the travel speeds on all of the lanes, and in fact do this without having to put public revenues into widening a road. Now, managing all of the existing lanes yields the most effective outcomes, as we've seen in New York City and Stockholm and Singapore and other places. Congestion pricing works. Mm-hmm. But, you know, and so one of the things that I've been talking about is integrated congestion and multimodal mobility management, or IC4M, another bit awkward engineering acronym, but basic principles of add no new lanes, road space when adopting managed lanes, toll the existing lanes instead, use behavioral approaches to achieve desired outcomes, and advance equity by reducing car dependence, expanding travel choices, and boosting efficiency. So the key elements of this are not just the physical lane, but also operational and behavioral elements, and giving people better support, better information, real-time communications, and incentives. And understanding how traffic science works, that, you know, effective corridor management keeps traffic in laminar flow conditions and avoiding the loss of capacity that happens when we get turbulent flow. When we're up here in the in this flow regime up here, we're moving at 60 miles an hour out until we get up to the maximum throughput is achieved. And then we fall out of laminar flow into turbulent flow. And then suddenly the throughput drops to 600 or 800 vehicles per hour per lane instead of 800, 1800 or 2000. So this again shows here in the upper picture, laminar flow, bottom picture, turbulent flow. Here's another image of it. This is State Road 91 in Southern California. The congested general purpose lanes, there are 4 of them, and they're carrying only 900 vehicles per hour per lane. The 2 toll managed lanes are carrying 1,600 vehicles per hour per lane and at twice the speed. So those managed lanes are being kept in laminar flow, and they're carrying as much traffic as the 4 unmanaged lanes. So if you manage all of the lanes, the tolls can be lower while protecting from a loss of peak period road capacity during the times when you want it the most. Infrastructure costs are lower, you have a greater shift towards more sustainable modes. But what if the state and local politics aren't ripe for congestion pricing or a pure hotter lane approach, which we've seen time and again in various places? Congestion pricing, in fact, almost died its last death in New York City right before it was implemented, when the governor pulled back from it in political fear before she changed her mind again. Well, I've been, again, working with Pat DeCorle-Souza at Federal Highways on this idea of flexi hot lanes, of taking a baby step towards congestion pricing by operating shoulders where you have enough capacity as managed lanes during peak hours, using overhead signage and things like that. And then that's one way to move into it, but also bringing in app-based vehicle occupancy detection for toll discounts or incentives. And this has been proven. It's being used in places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. It's a Bluetooth-based and smartphone-based app system that allows toll discounts to be given to users in specific quarters at specific times of day on managed lanes. And use of this app in Dallas has cut the number of HOV violations on these managed lanes from over 30% to under 2%. And they're processing 500,000 verifications monthly. You can use this technology to price any road, anywhere, anytime, without driver distraction and with privacy protection. So, I think there are some tools that we can bring to bear. I just recently did a paper with, I'm just wrapping up, to convert general purpose lanes to hot and operate shoulder lanes as part-time capacity, and doing this just during congested periods. And we found, in fact, doing this, again, this is a modeled approach that in 8-lane, 6-lane, 4-lane expressways under moderate or severe congestion, this approach could, in fact, deliver better travel speeds on these networks without widening the road and at much less cost. So with that, I'll close and invite your questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, anybody wants to start? Some? Regine, let's give the students maybe.
How did you deal with politics or with stakeholders or implementers who may be against your recommendations? About active travel.
Of course, all of these areas are fraught with political challenges, but we've also found, for example, in New York City, where congestion pricing was on the ropes and being on the verge of being stopped by a Democratic governor after it had already been approved, and it was within 30 days of turning the key and starting to collect the tolls, because all the gantries were in place, the governor decided, oh, if she implements it 6 months before the November election, it might cost the Democrats a couple of seats in the House of Representatives. And so she said, no, we're going to stop this. And so it didn't make a difference in the election. Everybody agrees that it didn't. But right after the election, then she reversed correction again and put it back in. But she did that because there were active demonstrations and protestations by thousands and thousands of people from various stakeholder interest groups saying, no, we need congestion pricing in New York. We need it for better transit revenues. We need it for traffic safety. We need it for air pollution. We need it for greenhouse emission reduction. So you can develop constituencies for these things. Now, New York is a different case than, trying to do this in St. Louis or, in some suburban jurisdiction. But, again, if you look at the experience of cities around the world in implementing these things, there are ways of building constituencies. If you look at Stockholm, Sweden, the support congestion pricing came about after years of campaigning by the Green Party. And the Green Party was in a coalition government with the Social Democrats in Stockholm at both the city level and the national level. And they made a condition of their continued support for the coalition. The Greens said, we want to have congestion tax for Stockholm. And so the Social Democrats reluctantly went along and they said, okay, we'll try it for 6 months. And then they designed it, they tried it for 6 months, and then they took it out for a couple of months and then held a referendum that was non-binding, in which they decided whether they were going to reinstitute the congestion charge or not for central Stockholm. And before they implemented the congestion charge, there were polls, I have a slide I can show, but there were polls that showed that 2/3 of all people were opposed to the congestion charge on the eve of its implementation. And then within 2 weeks of the implementation, suddenly it was popular because the drivers recognized that they were getting more reliable travel times, saving time. The transit users, cyclists and pedestrians were getting the benefits of safer, cleaner neighborhoods and travel conditions, and also better bus service and things like that. So there was a newspaper headline 2 weeks after congestion pricing first went in Stockholm that said, Stockholm loves the congestion charge, which, was the story right after everybody had hated it. It shifted public opinion so fast. And there are a number of papers that have documented this effect in city after city that's done congestion pricing. And then so in Stockholm, where they took the charge back after 6 months of trial, the congestion levels went right back to what they were before the charge went into effect. And people saw that. And so in that election where there was the non-binding referendum, the population at the ballot box said, yes, we want to reinstate the congestion charge. Now, it was still opposed by a small majority in the suburban counties with a strong support from the central areas of the city around Stockholm. But overall, it was a majority of support. And then the Social Democratic Green Coalition lost power in that election for reasons that had nothing to do with the congestion charge, because they'd been in power for a while and there were other scandals and things. The Conservative Coalition that came to power in that same election, one of the first things they did when they got back into office was to reinstate the congestion charge because it raised so much money, and it was indeed popular and accepted by people. So they put it back into effect, and then they took some of the revenues to build suburban motorways with the revenues, which was still an okay outcome because they got a better managed transport system out of it. So I think these are the kinds of, the politics are delicate and one has to approach them very strategically.
I had two questions. One, that was so interesting to see the turbulent and laminar flows, the turbulent and laminar phases. Is there a physics sort of thing, or is that only empirical, like physics relationship?
It's a complete analog to physics. When you in hydraulics, there are equations that describe turbulent and laminar flow, and there's a breakdown point, just as there is in traffic systems.
That part is super interesting. My second question was more practical. Like in Singapore at some point, I mean, the congestion pricing is the private car side of things. They also had policies on if you travel between these 2 hours in the morning or evening, travel is free. So that actually brought in the public transit side of things and said, if we reward some behaviors, and that also sort of balanced out the road travel versus the public transit. So did you try something like that in New York as well, combining giving rewards for public transit or shifts to public transit vis-a-vis?
In New York, the parameters under which congestion pricing were implemented were fairly strictly laid out by the state legislature in a law that was passed in 2017 or 18, which described which roads had to be the boundary and what time of day the charges could apply and how much revenue should be raised by the design. And so we, as staff, my agency, my staff team actually was in charge of the evaluation of congestion pricing for the environmental review process in partnership with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which was the agency that was officially appointed to implement the charge and to receive the money and then to disperse it for better public transport investments. And so our opportunities for designing the tolling structure were circumscribed quite a lot. And there were a lot of things I would have liked to have tested and said, no, this would be a better way to do it. We couldn't do those things. We had to work within the parameters of the law that was passed. But I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned if you look at the structure of congestion charging programs in different cities around the world that have done them. Stockholm, I think, does the best job of any city, and they have about 80 different charging points on their arterial and motorway network. They adjust the tolls across the hours of the day in like 7-minute or 10-minute increments. They can up or down what the charge is at a specific cordon location. And they do that based on observed traffic patterns over the last 3 months. They make adjustments every 3 months. And they do it with the goal of keeping the traffic free flowing at least 80% of the time on the network. So it's a network management goal. And to a large degree, they've allowed the technocrats who operate and manage the system to make key decisions about how to adjust it and fine tune it so that it achieves the system goals. I'm a big believer in trying to move towards urban traffic corridor and system management as a public utility, where we have the public elected officials setting goals for what we want to achieve in network reliability and efficiency and modal outcomes and environmental outcomes, and then giving the agencies that are responsible or public-private operators or concessionaires the authority to make adjustments within some parameters of how the system is operated to achieve those goals. And just like we do with electric utilities in many places where We tell the utility operator we want high reliability in the electricity system. We don't want brownouts and blackouts in the system all the time. In fact, we tolerate brownouts and blackouts in our surface transport networks on a routine basis because we don't have competent governance structures and management structures for those networks. And